This military display of coordination is certainly impressive. But the question I ask myself is why someone would choose to take part in this kind of exercise, that is, try to coordinate with a group of this size. And as I mentioned yesterday, observing my kids learning how to interact and coordinate, figuring out which game they should play, I realized just how hard it is to coordinate with several others. So why and how do we do it? And how does this differ, say, from contexts where we're only interacting with one other person? Today, I will take an interdisciplinary approach to investigate group temporal coordination and consider the changes that occur at the level of the individual in group interactions. So specifically, I will look for the me in the we. Now, in McNeil's Keeping in Time Together, he does much of the work for me to introduce the idea of what he calls muscular bonding, which is what he perceived when marching in a military context. Now, obviously, for the purposes of experimental control, most of the studies to date have focused on the interaction between two individuals. But this so-called muscular bonding, these efforts we make together with others, are rarely done with just one other person. In fact, many of the things we do, from sport to surgical interventions, we do in groups. And when we do things together, we feel a sense of pervasive well-being, a strange sense of personal enlargement and becoming bigger than life. I should point out that I've not chosen this particular text, so talking about military marching, because of my institutional affiliation, but rather that it seems important to consider the functional rationale for why armies make their soldiers march, probably to help them become aligned, to feel bigger, to feel connected. Now, this is obviously his anecdotal observation. What we're trying to do with our work that I'll be presenting today is to quantify some of these subjective feelings. One of the other questions that I've already mentioned today in some of the previous talks is, how big does the group have to be to have these effects? We heard about herding in this morning's session. But the central question for today is, what happens to the individual as the group gets larger? These are central questions for my talk today. Now, before I start, I should say that we already know a lot about how and why we coordinate with one other person. And a lot of what I say today will be me extrapolating from this. Additionally, there are already several very good studies, and some of them we have seen and heard about today and yesterday, that have already started to look at groups interacting. Very early on, we had Richardson and colleagues looking at spontaneous coordination of people in rocking chairs. We heard from Alan Wing and Mark Elliott yesterday about their impressive and ecological work on musical ensembles. More recently, Müller and colleagues have shown how professional choirs coordinated, but also reorganized into smaller groups, depending on whether they were singing in canons or in unison. Now, one of only a handful of studies have looked at dance. This is the Chauvigny et al. Paper from 2019. And what they showed was that there is an effect of holding hands, of having multisensory information to couple in groups. We also see work from our last speaker, Maria Lombardi, in Alderizio et al., doing a lovely experiment with people waving hands. And we'll do our own version of this in tomorrow's workshop, so please stay tuned for that. But taking these studies as a lead, my work focuses on these medium-sized groups because it seems to me to be the size in which we most often coordinate with others. Now, I will try and look at how the exchange of information results in changes both at the level of objective temporal coordination, but also the subjective feelings about our bodies and ourselves with respect to the group. So first, I'll try and make the point that lower sensory motor approaches that quantify coupling and indeed uncoupling are necessary to investigate how coordination scales up from dyads to groups. I'll then take a slightly more theoretical approach to discuss one of my primary hypotheses regarding the nonlinear way in which things scale, namely the sense of self as a function of the size and makeup of the group. Put another way, my work asks the question, what happens to the me in the we? And I present the concept of a so-called self-to-other ratio. And then, depending on time, I will move on to the data from two studies that employ a novel group walking paradigm, which bears remarkable similarity to several of the studies we've already heard about. So much group walking here at Social Bridges. And I will hopefully convince you of its strengths in terms of immersive, ecological, and flexible properties. So the first point I'd like to make is that although my task is one that falls squarely in this category of sensory-motor synchronization, what I'd like to talk to you about is what happens when we try to become synchronized. That is the dynamic give and take that can be seen as a negotiation. So let us look at these two signals, one representing the self, me, and the other representing the other or others. Now, while absolute synchronization, say between my movements and yours, is boring and uninformative on the left-hand side, the other on the right, with various levels of variance in phase and amplitude, it not only looks more exciting, but I would posit is far more useful to us as a social species. I slow down and you slow down accordingly. I slow down too much and you decide to take the lead and bring us back to a tempo that will get us to our destination in time. This type of information exchange, which may vary in its directionality and symmetry, is above all things informative. It might tell us about who we're walking with in terms of their personality, their health, and so on. And as such, I might be so bold as to say that it may form the basis of all other social exchanges. I've already told you that what hopefully makes the work I am presenting particularly exciting is that it aims to create a bridge between the causes of coordination and the consequences of these coordinated experiences. To my mind, the primary cause of those immersive feelings we heard through McNeil's words has been described as coupling. The important takeaway is that signals can become coupled through the exchange of information. And here we see some figures from a very early paper by Petrovathan in the late 70s describing the reciprocal exchange between the primary dyad, the caregiver and infant, what they call so-called split-second mutual adjustments that result in temporal patterns that are matched, their words, not mine. It is suggested that through this exchange of information, in this case primarily visual, the two individuals become coupled, and importantly, this forms the basis of sharing and communication. Now, the caveat to this is that coupling as a correlation between two signals can occur spuriously, or the coupling may be non-informative. Now, my key objective is to quantify the degree of coupling and identify cases of true reciprocal mutual adjustment. That is, to use a computationally rich definition of coupling. I should mention that Guillaume Dumas and I have a preprint out which does exactly this. It talks about how to quantify coupling in real cases of social interaction. As we discuss in that paper, coupling can occur at various levels: physiological, behavioral, or neural. Now, the work I present today will focus on behavioral coupling, that is, looking at sensory motor data that shows how one person's action in time becomes coordinated with another. The important points here are that the task we use is dynamic, which allows us to look at how coordination changes in time. This is particularly important if you want to go beyond simply saying that a group is either in sync or not. So instead, we can look at how groups, even of complete strangers, become coupled and then uncoupled again. Moreover, a fundamental difference between dyads and groups is the increased range of structural reorganization of the constituents of the network and the links between them across time. And we've seen several very pretty node drawings over the last 2 days. Now, the organization of a group is likely to vary when there is a predetermined leader who provides reliable temporal cues. At the level of the dyad, I've described these leader-follower dynamics in terms of a change in attentional focus and change in the relative contribution of self and other information. And Peter very kindly presented this work earlier today. However, in a group of more than two, the ratio of self to other information and the effect it has on social cognitive processing will become more complex. These types of reorganization can be described in terms of attractor dynamic patterns, the underlying topological features of which can be inferred with a combination of differential equation modeling with mixture modeling. And indeed, I believe that it's these modeling approaches that may hold the key to identifying factors of who we interact with, i.e. the presence of a leader, and how we interact with them. For example, how we recover after a perturbation, and that these underpin the dynamics of interpersonal coordination. Members of a string quartet will sit in such a way so as to hear and see each other for optimal information exchange. But does that information exchange need to be reciprocal and symmetrical, all to all, for optimal performance? We saw some of these coupling changes across the members of a string quartet in Alan's talk yesterday. What I'm proposing here is that new computational approaches that take into account a weighting factor of the self as respect to other information might be key to settling this debate. When we are in a big crowd, social information about others as well as feedback regarding our own actions may be drowned out and therefore less accessible. Will more information about our actions and those of other agents make coordination easier? And will this be reflected in subjective measures of coordination? And will this hold true only up to a certain point, depending on the number of interacting agents? Mengxiang Zhang, who spoke yesterday, and her colleagues have highlighted the gap between very small, so the dyad, and very large groups, like a crowd, and the need for a more comprehensive understanding of how group size affects coordination and the consequences thereof. So today, I'm going to show you data from 2 studies that look at intermediate-sized ensembles. And earlier today, you heard from Dominic Banaku of our work using VR, which I think truly holds the key to being able to ecologically, but in an empirically controlled manner, to test the following 2 hypotheses. As group size increases, processing demands of social information increases, and the coupling profile between the participant and the agents should change accordingly. And the second, as group size increases, the self to other ratio will be reduced, though perhaps not in cases of high similarity, which will affect both information processing on the one hand, but also feelings of connectedness to the group on the other. Now, one of the main theoretical claims I hope to prove experimentally is that as we scale up from dyads to group, the way in which information pertaining to self and other will differ. But the questions we have to ask is whether it is just a linear scaling effect. Will interacting in a large group mean that the self is drowned out? And if so, what constitutes a large group? Now, this concept is not entirely my own. Instead, from the social psychology literature, I found work by Mullen, who has described the phenomenology of being in a group and has highlighted the role of group composition. And we heard about this in our work in VR in Domini's talk earlier today, where we look at racially different or similar groups. My other inspiration when thinking about this ratio is work by the musicologist Turnstrom, who didn't look at coordination per se, but rather changes in the volume of choir singers and how much sound they needed to keep their preferred self to other ratio. Now this highlights inter-individual differences in this ratio. Now, we can think of our 2 signals, and please imagine that these are nicely highly variable time courses rather than these boring and uninformative synchronized ones, as relating to self and other information, self in purple, green for the other. Now, these can either be balanced as shown in the top panel, or in the case of a leader who is focusing more on self-related information to ensure that they are keeping a steady rhythm for the others to follow, or perhaps when dealing with someone who is highly unreliable, like the soprano, focusing instead on the self. So we have a higher purple contribution than green. By contrast, if you are a follower, you might focus more on monitoring changes in the leader, or perhaps what we see in a mob is that access to self-related information is made more difficult, and so you see a higher amount of represented other or green information. Now, obviously, in the dyadic cases, the me-we ratio is easier to consider conceptually, but also computationally less challenging. However, as we scale up from a dyad to groups of increasing size, the integration segregation challenge, which Peter mentioned earlier today, whereby individuals need to identify the most informative signal to selectively integrate those external rhythms to their own movement and segregate themselves from the external rhythms when they prove inefficient for the purpose. So we see that when we interact with others, and indeed when we interact with increasingly larger groups of others, this segregation integration challenge becomes particularly important. And what I'm showing here on the left are 2 synchronizations, so objective temporal coordination measures, which try to capture these self-related focused actions, which is the shown here in the red, or a measure of standard deviation of the asynchrony, so that is the degree of coupling or the interaction, which requires this more integrative mode. Okay. Enough of the theory, let us get to the experiment. Now, I think sports offer a wonderful model of how we do things together with many others. And there is indeed quite a bit of observational work done to see how team makeup affects performance. And we'll see some nice work, which is pretty computational, by Pedro Passos tomorrow. However, clearly tracking footballers on a field is equally difficult to do, and it's pretty hard to control experimentally. So for now, the model I'd like to present is both highly flexible and highly controllable. With it, we're investigating the effect of group size as it interacts with factors related to, on the one hand, the nature of the partners, so who we're interacting with, as well as the information that we are getting from them, so the how. Like my previous work, it is a sensory-motor synchronization paradigm that models how we walk together with others in a group, kind of like in a musical marching band. But departing from tasks involving limb coordination, like my beloved finger tapping, here I implemented tasks chosen for its inactive and ecological quality. So it involves the whole body. And indeed, we have plans of doing something more like dance, which hopefully will be even more ecologically valid. The reason being is that we want to capture this immersive quality, which is so important for modulating these higher subjective feelings of agency as we move into the virtual reality environment. What happens in our task is that a participant hears a pacing signal, which dictates a given tempo. This is the so-called initiation phase, and is then instructed to walk on the spot in time with a pacing signal while being surrounded by other social agents walking with them. This is the so-called synchronization phase. Now, in some cases, the pacing signal stops playing and the participant or participants are asked to continue walking in time. And we have a so-called continuation phase not shown here. In all of the experiments, the participant is also hearing and sometimes seeing other individuals walking around them. Now, these agents might be real people or the sounds of real people, or indeed programmable virtual agents in our VR experiments that Domna showed us today. The dynamic nature of the paradigm captures the rich nature of the give and take, so integral to social interactions. And my hope is that with novel modeling approaches, the changes in coupling over time and across interactions, interacting agents will help to describe and detail alignment in groups. Moreover, this is an intentional interpersonal coordination task, and it therefore creates a bridge between the causes and consequences of interpersonal group coordination by studying, on the one hand, lower level sensory motor coordination and the effects this has on subjective feelings about oneself and the people with whom we're interacting. And that's what I've tried to capture here, these so-called causes and consequences, how well we coordinate using objective measures of coupling, and on the other, these consequences, how coordination makes us feel. And these are a couple of the measures that we're using. With this highly flexible, ecological, and adaptable design, I'm trying to forge a link between these two, how intentional coordination makes us feel, and capturing low-level mechanisms that underpin how we coordinate. These include measures of gait change and temporal synchrony, which are easily derived from self and other footsteps timing onsets. And then we can compare these to subjective reports of perceived size, oneness, you'll remember McNeil's words, hopefully, affiliation, co-presence, and importantly, agency. These objective measures will be analyzed using linear approaches, but we've also fed them into models devised in a new set of work where I'm trying to use changes in coupling to identify moments where interacting agents become coupled, maintain synchrony, or indeed become uncoupled or decoupled. Now, I'd like to just give you an overview of the kinds of work that we do, and I'll be focusing primarily on the left-hand panel in the middle, and Domna's very kindly done the work for me to tell you about our work in virtual reality. In the first, we have the sounds of our footsteps and the sounds of those around us. I'm working with Ana Tajadura Jimenez, who is also involved in the virtual reality work that Domna presented earlier today. We work together in London to try and see how the sounds of our footsteps and the sounds of others change the way we move, but also how we feel about our bodies. In this particular experiment, the participant was walking in these very, very classy pair of white sandals, and then they heard the sounds of 8 pre-recorded partners who were placed around them in this 3x3 matrix. So the participant was in the middle of the square, and they had 8 virtual auditory partners around them who either were walking in the same pair of white, very snazzy sandals, or a pair of incredibly cool cowboy boots. And so we have a very easy set of 4 conditions, a 2x2 design, where we had people who were either wearing distinct footwear around us, the cowboy boots, or the same, and therefore made similar sounds wearing the sandals. And then we had a second factor of having those people walk either in sync with the metronome or walking together out of sync. And the hypothesis is we wanted to see how this changes the way we coordinate, but also how we feel about ourselves and the group. And we can think of our study as having 2 tasks. And this is really the crux of what I want to say today. One is the explicit task of synchronizing our actions with the metronome. And then an implicit task, which is that we assume participants will become coupled. That is, they will coordinate their actions as a function of similarity and synchronicity with those of the people they're walking around with. So we have this pool between the explicit task, go and synchronize with the metronome, and this other implicit task that we are social creatures, we'll hear the sounds of people around us and maybe we'll be pulled towards them. Now, what will we find? We have on this panel, hopefully everything you need to know. We will look at that integration segregation challenge where we assume that when people are focusing on themselves, where they're segregating the other information, we'll see a greater degree of stability of self-paced action. That's what we're seeing on the left. And when people have information that's useful to them, they'll integrate other information into their representation. So they'll have both self and other information being processed. And that's indeed what we see. On the left-hand side, we see that people are indeed more reliable in their self-paced tapping when the people they're walking around with are more similar to them. So they use that information. That information is very difficult to integrate with them. So they focus instead just on themselves. There's a blur between me and you because we're making similar sounds. We do also see a near significant main effect of synchronicity, but I'll leave that for now. Conversely, when we look at the self-other integrative side of things, we have instead a coordination performance measure, the standard deviation of the asynchrony, how well we coupled with one another. And in this case, it's coupled with the metronome. So we're talking here about the explicit task, I should mention. Now, in this explicit task where I want to coordinate with the metronome, people are both, we see a main effect of synchronicity. So it's much easier to, and we coordinate much better when the information around us is, when the people walking around us are not making this cacophonous asynchronous sound. But we more importantly see an interaction such that greatest performance is when we get distinct and synchronous information. So when that information is reliable and when it is distinct, we can use it to our advantage and do better at our task. I should probably just mention for those of you following at home, low in this case is good. But now let's move more to those consequences. If those were the causes, these low-level sensory-motor coordination parameters that we've been looking at, what are the consequences of doing things together? Well, we see that greater synchronization performance when walking with synchronous others wearing the different footwear. So again, if it's reliable information, we do best. But what happens at that subjective level? Well, synchronicity has positive effects on reports of body strength and elongation, emotional valence and dominance, and feelings of affiliation. Now, hopefully you're remembering the words of McNeill, and these are therefore some nice empirical data to support those observations that he made. Now, we suggest that when part of a larger group, we feel a smaller part of the whole. Further, the more similar we sound as a group, the closer we feel to others. I'd like to think a little bit about this idea of self-focused attention versus self-other interaction, which is based on the work we heard about earlier from Mullen. Now, we feel part of the group either as a function of synchronicity, how you are behaving, but also maybe as a function of the footwear you're wearing, so how you sound. And we have to go on both of these pieces of information when we decide to integrate or segregate. What we see is that we have greater self-other overlap in the asynchronous condition. We also see that we have greater agency in the synchronous conditions, which is perhaps very important because as a primary takeaway, being part of a group does not need to mean losing a sense of self. Now, as we are running out of time, I'm going to finish up by saying that I do have another study where we are looking now not at people walking with just the sounds of others, but rather in a live science experiment at the Tate. We had 7 people walking together, 7 strangers walking together on the spot, and this time arranged in a circular array. And if you're interested, we can talk a little bit more about these results, which are in a preprint available as of today. And there is some information that talks to both these causes of coordination as well as the consequences. So we have some various measures which look very similar to the ones I've already talked about today. So just to wrap up, I want to say that we know that coordination acts as a social glue. And what I've tried to tell you is that it would be interesting to see how this glue works as we scale up to larger groups. But why my work is perhaps new is I've tried to take an interdisciplinary approach. So think about things from a more philosophical and indeed theoretical point of view. And I've tried to create this link between measures of the causes of coordination as well as the consequences, using a very ecological, adaptable, flexible task. And what will be nice is as we go forward is to see how this changes as a function of group sizes with our virtual reality version of the experiment. And why is this important? Why do we care? I should probably have started with that. But maybe it's nice here to sort of stimulate some discussion. I think it'll be useful as we move into talking about human-computer interfaces, where we need to make sure that the humans interacting with these computers have a feeling of self. We can think about the clinical cases, and we'll hear from Dimitris Bolis tomorrow, and we've heard some talks today about autism, where we might think about theories of misattunement, where people don't feel the same as others, and maybe we see a distinction between how self and that information is used. And obviously scaling up to the very large, we can think about the implications this has on social or political contexts. And that just leaves me to thank you all for your attention, but also all the people who've helped me do this work. In no particular order, Domna Banaku, Ana Tajadura Jimenez, Peter Keller, Fatikan Atay, Mathieu Galotti, and Chris Frith, who've helped me more with the theoretical side, along with Ophelia de Roy, Guillaume Dumas, Baha Tungjenk, who's helped with this work at the Tate, Stephen Guillon, who's been helping me work on some of the new models, and Owen Travers, who was also involved in the Tate work. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention. And if there are any questions, I'll check the YouTube channel myself. Travis says, very interesting talk, Merle. Have you looked at or know of anyone else that has, whether there are differences between individualistic and collective cultures and whether that might affect the tendency towards synchronization as well as the degree of self-other overlap? I think that this is a fantastic question. And as far as I know, there isn't, but it is certainly something I'm very keen to investigate. And one of the benefits of this virtual reality design is that we will be using it in different cultures, so to speak. So as you all know, I work for the Bundeswehr University in Munich, and I have the wonderful pleasure of being surrounded by people who have a very collectivist attitude. And so I'm very much hoping to be able to compare samples of people who come from a collectivist culture, but maybe not necessarily from a different country, and those who do not. And I think that that might be a more controlled way to do that. So stay tuned. I'll hopefully be able to tell you more about that soon.